Okay, so we're going to start the Sicha from volume 1 for Parshas Tazria. Al pasuk Ishaki Tazria. Tazria means will be inseminated. That's basically what it means. Ve'ada zachar. So a woman who is no, that's exactly what it doesn't mean. It means that she has been inseminated, and she gives birth to a male. What?
She was pregnant.
First of all, she had to be inseminated, then she can give birth. In the middle, she had to be pregnant. But the point is that from here, this is the parsha that deals with the laws of pregnancy and birth. So one of the laws that we learn, for instance, is circumcision. That when she has a child, if it's a male, he needs to be circumcised on the 8th day. Why is it repeated here? Where Abraham already received this commandment, because we do it because of this parsha, not because of what Abraham's was something in and of itself. It was before the giving of the Torah. And as the Rebbe says, Abraham received this as a reward, one might say, for his service of God. But the mitzvot are not a reward. Okay? The mitzvot, the commandments of God, are not to be treated as a reward. They're not a reward for your acting nicely. That was by Abraham. That was in the time before the giving of the Torah. The giving of the Torah changes the whole relationship between man and God, and it makes it into a relationship of a master and a servant. Whereas before, the relationship was more of a father and son. Okay? By Abraham and by Isaac and Jacob and the patriarchs before the giving of the Torah, it was more like a father and son relationship, meaning that it was a natural, innate relationship. And an innate relationship depends on actions from both sides. But the master-servant relationship, taking a servant is like marrying it's like the same verb as marrying a woman. Ki kach. You take, in the sense that it's ownership. So that ownership, on the one hand, it doesn't sound so good for people in the modern era, because when we say God owns me, so they see that as some kind of affront to who they are. But the meaning of it is that the relationship cannot be broken. That the bond is above reason.
Irrevocable.
It's irrevocable. Of course, it says that in the end of times, the two types come together. It's called Ben Shenasa Evid. It's a son who becomes a servant. And so he has both worlds in him. And that's the status that we have today.
When an Evid who became a son?
What?
Couldn't it be more appropriate to say an Evid who became a son?
No, because we were first sons, and then we became servants. Okay. First, there were the patriarchs, and they were sons of Hashem. And then, once the Torah was given, it's like becoming a servant of Hashem. So it goes from becoming a son who becomes a servant. The other side of it is, of course, that the way that people are today, the way that people feel today, is that first of all they feel that they're sons. They feel that they're entitled. And then, if you're able to explain to them that, look, there's another side to this relationship with God, which might be higher, and you might want to look into it, and they'll be willing to pursue the side of being a servant, so then it's a son who becomes a servant. But of course, the real reason for all of this is that that's the parable. The parable is that a king had a son. And in the beginning, the son acts like he's his father's child. So he's privileged and entitled to many, many things. It's only when he grows up and he matures, and he begins to understand the value of performing the king's will, that he transforms from a son into a servant. Because what does he see? He sees that the king trusts his servants in a way that he can't even trust his family. And that's a well-known thing. And so the son says, I'm very dedicated to my father. I also want to be at that level. And so he moves from the state of being a servant, being a son, into being a servant. And that's sort of like the transition that happened for all the Rebbeim, who were sons of a Rebbe. So in the beginning they were like a son. But as they matured, they understood that it's good to be a chassid also. A servant is like a chassid. Okay. And because that's a little bit not related to what we're going to be learning, but it's important to say this. Okay. The sages build on this statement, on this verse, something that is, you could say, a reflection of medicine in their time. Okay. By Aristotle, it was clear that the man doesn't contribute anything to the sex of the child. Nothing. That was Aristotle. That was a theory in the time of the 4th century, 3rd century, 2nd century. But then came along Galen. And Galen, how did they learn science back then? They didn't have any way to, look under a microscope and see what's happening. So they had to use their philosophical analysis. So one of the best tools in philosophical analysis is a metaphor. So the metaphor in Aristotle's time was that the male is like drops of water on the ground. And the water does not define at all what kind of tree is going to come out of the ground or what kind of produce is going to be created. That was the analogy in the time of Aristotle. But then Galen hit upon the idea that that's not exactly what it is. Rather, the male is not the water that's enriching the earth and making it possible for something to grow. Rather, the male is the seed that's planted in the ground. So the moment that you say that, so obviously the male has a tremendous impact and contribution to the sex of the child. But the sages took this one step further, and they say like this: Ish mazriat chila yoledet nekeva. If the man inseminates first, then she gives birth to a girl, to a female. But if the woman inseminates first, yoledet zachar, she gives birth to a male. What does this mean? So, when you take the Galenic analogy, it's hard to understand. I mean, you can understand why the male would cause the sex, which is how we see it today. But why would the woman have a contribution to the sex by inseminating, of all things? So there was no knowledge back then of chromosomes and, X chromosome, Y chromosome, anything about that. So you have to say that this is one of the best examples that the sages, when they take science, the science of their times, they are critical of it when they need to be. And their criticism is not whether you've done the experiment right or not, because in this case it was no experimentation done, it was just an analogy. But they say no, it's not so simple, because what does the verse say? Isha ki Tazria v'yalda zachar. The pshat, the literal meaning of the verse is the woman inseminated and she gave birth to a son, to a male. So you can't take that away from her. We don't want to take away the science, so we find a way to say what the science says and what the Torah says. Obviously, this is not a scientific statement, but it's taking the science of the time, saying, I don't want to ignore that. We know that the man is, at least in our time, that's how they understood. In their time, that's how they understood in the 2nd, 3rd century, that the man is contributing to the sex of the child. But we also can't take away the pshat of the Torah. So we have to create a hybrid form of this whole saying. And that's what the sages created. They created a hybrid form. You look in the Bechaye, the Rebbe here doesn't mention it, but there's a Sichot where he does mention it. You look in the Bechaye, he gives the whole, at least as much as he knew, the whole development of this concept, from Aristotle to Galen to his time. Bram. Now the Rebbe is not going to talk at all about the physical scientific side of this, of determining the sex of the child. He's going to talk about something entirely different. There's a principle in Chassidus that this is only this principle that we just said, that if the woman inseminates first, she gives birth to a male, and if the male inseminates first, he gives birth to a female. This is only now, in the present. ואילו לעתיד לבוא, יהיה הוולד בבחינת זכר גם כשאיש מזריע תחילה. And in the future, we're going to go back to call it, to the Aristotelian picture of things, where the male, as a word, does not contribute. That's what you would think at first, but that's not what's happening. And even when the male inseminates first, it's not going to be a girl born, but a male. So that's already clearly not scientific. We're not talking about science anymore. So what are they trying to say? Where did they learn this also from? They learned this from a pasuk in Yeshaya. כאמור בתורה אור לפסוק, ולציון יאמר איש ואיש יולד בה. And to Zion it will be said, a man and a man will be born in it. What do you mean, a man and a man? I'm still in chapter 1, second paragraph. I didn't jump. Still in the same place. Second paragraph. ולציון יאמר איש ואיש יולד בה. And to Zion it will be said, a man and a man will be born in it. What do you mean, a man and a man? Ish va'ish. What's this thing? A man and a man. What does it say? A man will be born in it. What does it mean, a man and a man? So the sages say, this refers that even when the male inseminates first, the husband inseminates first, the result will be a boy. And there will no longer be any girls, as it were. Obviously, we're not talking physically, so we have to understand this, right? גם כשאיש מזריע יולד בבחינת זכר. So even when the male inseminates first, the result will be a male. So again, just to recap. In the Torah it says, if the woman inseminates first, there is a boy. That's all it says. It doesn't tell us anything about the girl. The sages built a hybrid form of this saying, that contained both the scientific knowledge of their time and what the Torah says. And they said, if the male inseminates first, it's a girl, and if the woman inseminates first, it'll be a boy. But in Chassidus, based on a verse in Isaiah, we learn that this is only now, but in the future it will be that regardless of who inseminates first, whether it's the woman or the man, the result will be a male, a child.
No more female children.
Yeah, so obviously we're not talking about physical conception. So what is this talking about? That's why he says b'chinat zachar, an aspect of the male. דוגמה לדבר זה אנו מוצאים גם עתה. So he says we already have examples of this principle that function in our times. For instance, בליקוטי תורה לפרשתנו מוסבר שעל ידי שמחה של מצווה נגרם שתלד זכר. So in Likkutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe explains that to give birth to a male can be done by having joy in performing a mitzvah. So obviously this is a completely different area. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the relationship between man and God. And here, man and God are like the husband and wife. And the question is, who is awakening first? So instead of saying insemination, we would say, who is awakening? Right? So, משום ששמחה של מצווה למטה מעוררת שמחה גם למעלה, because joy below, meaning the person takes joy in doing the mitzvah. He davens with great joy. He keeps Shabbos with great joy. He keeps kashrus with great joy. He learns Torah with tremendous joy. So his awakening with joy below awakens joy above. ושמחה פורצת גדר, and it is the nature of joy that it eradicates any borders, any limits, meaning joy disseminates limits. It makes things infinite. עד ששרות כל ההגבלות שנובעות מסדר הבריאה, ובכללן גם ההגבלה של איש מזריע תחילה יולדת נקבה. And so, in this case, the joy eradicates whatever limits there are that were, even those that were created by the formation of the universe, meaning physical laws. It is possible to overcome physical laws using joy. That's what this principle says. So, one of these, since we said there is a scientific aspect to this, Ish Mazriat Chila Yoledet Nekeva, we said that this was the addition of Galen. That was the thing that he added. So, comes the Alter Rebbe and says that this will be eradicated. Meaning, it will not be necessary for the male to give birth only to a female. The male will also be able to give birth to a female. And you could say that that's how we understand things today, going back to the physical understanding. But again, we're not talking just about the physical understanding. We're not just talking about conception. Our understanding today is that the male is responsible for whether it's female or male. He's not saying that it has to be a male. He's saying it can be. Whereas in Galenic times, the 2nd, 3rd century of science, there they thought it was impossible for the male to conceive a male. The male could only conceive a female. Okay. So, what does this mean? Derech mashal. So he says, let's take a parable. מלך בשר ודם כשהוא שרוי בשמחה, הוא חורג מגדריו וחוקיו, והוא מתגלה לכל, כקטן כגדול. When a king, or a very wealthy individual, is in great joy, and he's now throwing a party, he reveals himself without any limits, to everyone, equally, whether they're great or small. The same thing holds above. בגלל השמחה מתגלית האלוקות הנעלית מהגבלה ושרות כל ההגבלות. Because of the joy that was awakened from below, and now there's joy above, that causes the Almighty to reveal Himself without any limits also, equally to those who are great and those who are small. הפנימיות שבדברי, what does this mean internally? שמחה שמצווה באה לידי התבוננות בחשיבות המצוות. The joy that accompanies a mitzvah is the result of meditating, thinking, contemplating the importance of what it means to have a mitzvah, to have a commandment from God. שבאמצעותן נמשך אור שהוא נעלה מכל יחס לעולמות, ואפילו מגילוי האור שבגן עדן. That thanks to the mitzvah, because the mitzvah is beyond my understanding, beyond my reason, what is drawn down by me performing the mitzvah is greater than all the light that was used, all the revelation of God that was used to create reality.
What mitzvah?
Any mitzvah.
So why does it only come about in the case of Purva?
No, it's not saying. It's just giving, again, we're just using that as the backdrop. But it's in every mitzvah. ואפילו מגילוי האור שבגן עדן. It's even greater than the revelation of God that will be in the Garden of Eden. This we know from the Tanya, right? Because the world to come, we talked about this one time, the world to come, the world of resurrection is made out of the mitzvos, the commandments that we did, the energy that was expended on performing mitzvot. Why? Because the world of souls, where the soul goes after departing from the body, after it finishes its 120 years in this world, that world is called the Garden of Eden. And there all you have is the light that was procured through learning Torah. Torah is also a mitzvah, but we're talking about the light that was procured in the sense of understanding, that the person understood what the Torah is saying.
So if you didn't understand, you had a problem.
No, so that when you go to Gan Eden, so they teach you of the things that you try to understand, that you're taught that everything that you could have understood if you had more time, or maybe if you had more brains, right? So that you're taught, but something that you didn't even try, that you'll have no connection to. So you have to at least try to see the entire Torah. Right?
That's good. So it means it's not a waste of time sitting and not understanding it.
Well, of course not. Of course not. I mean, you have to, in this world, it's a question about whether you're performing anything. Maybe it's not a mitzvah. You're losing the mitzvah aspect of it. Because the mitzvah of learning Torah means to understand at least at some level, when we're talking about the oral tradition. The written tradition, the Bible, you can just read. And even if you don't understand, you'll revisit it when you're in the Garden of Eden. Okay. And as the sages say, יפה שעה אחת בתשובה ומעשים טובים בעולם הזה מכל חיי העולם הבא. This is the usual quote to illustrate this, that it's better to have 1 hour of tshuva and good deeds in this world than all the life of the world to come, all the life of the soul in the Garden of Eden. כל חיי העולם הבא הם עדיין בגדר נבראים, והרי נבראים מוגבלים, ואילו המצוות הן רצונו יתברך שהוא בלי גבול כלל. All of the world to come, meaning the world of souls, is still what we call creation, part of creation, and all that's in creation, all the creatures are limited. But the mitzvot, the commandments, they're a manifestation of God's will, and that has no limits. So when you meditate on this, when you contemplate this, and what do you understand? You understand that doing a mitzvah is the greatest thing you could do in the world. Because you're bringing down light, you're bringing down a revelation of God. Light means a revelation. So it's a revelation of God that is what? That is greater than the entire world, than the entire reality. Because it's not of this world. To put tefillin on is not a logical conclusion that one would come to from living in the world. Right? It has to have come from something higher. Kakatuv, and then you'll perform the mitzvah with great joy and even with a good heart, as it says, "Avadat et Hashem Elokecha b'simcha v'tuv levav." It says the pasuk is "Ki lo avadta tachat asher lo avadta." And here he doesn't quote the beginning of the pasuk; it just says, "You shall serve Hashem out of a good heart and out of joy, merov kol, and of plenty." Minayin noveh avat Hashem Elokecha b'simcha v'tuv levav, merov kol, musag kolel kol amot hana'alim beyoter. So where do you get this power, this strength to have joy in doing a mitzvah? From rov kol, from plenty. And plenty means that which comes beyond the world. Plenty is overflowing. It's beyond what sustains the world as they are now, the reality that we live in right now. Okay. And what this means is that the joy of a mitzvah comes from the person engaging and touching upon and connecting to God's very substance, which is beyond all of reality, and is not limited in any way. So this causes the eradication of the limits below, and then it can be that even a male can give birth to a male. We still haven't explained what's going on here, right?
Yeah, but what about if the mitzvah is done with total kapolos only? You don't get any joy out of it.
No, so that's not it yet. I mean, you're nullifying yourself. That's very good, but to really be able to go beyond the limits of this world, it's not enough to have nullification. That's not enough. There has to be joy also. In that sense, this is one of the interesting things. You think the nullification, which is a person nullifying themselves, so there's no vessels left. There's only light. You would think that would be higher than joy. Joy is an expansion. Expansion is always related to vessels. Always, because vessels, they expand. Right? We call it extension. Anything that's, call it relatively material, relatively concrete, is extensive. It extends. That's why joy is so powerful, because it sort of expands and destroys everything in its path. So whatever limits there were, they're gone now. They don't exist anymore. So you would think that the nullification would be higher than the joy. But this is one of the examples that the vessels are high, the root of the vessels is higher than the root of the lights. Shoresh kelim gavoa mishoresh haorot.
Isn't that always the case? How can you have all if you don't have a vessel to put it in?
Because the first thing you think is that there's light. There's first of all revelation. After there's revelation, then mitabu haorot nitavu kelim. From the thickening of the light came about the vessels. Again, tell me what your message is, and I'll give you the right tools to carry it out, right, to spread it out. But if you don't tell me what the content is, how can I build the right vessel for you? How can I build the right campaign for you? The campaign's going to be the vessels. It says, no, it's not true. Even though that's the order in which things happen, you're right. That how can you have light if you have to have some vessel to put it into? So the order is that you have some light and then you put it into a vessel. But the real order is, in their source, is that the vessel actually comes from a higher place than the light. So in this case, the vessel is the joy. Because joy, what does joy mean? Joy means a person feels themselves. You can't have joy and not feel yourself. You can't be in a state of joy and not have extension, not feel yourself expanding. That's what joy means, literally. But this joy, it brings about something higher than just the regular light. The regular light is that only if a woman inseminates first can it be a male. But when there's joy added to it, so that rule is eradicated. And suddenly the male can also beget a male. That's a tremendous chiddush. Again, he still hasn't explained to us exactly how do you apply this, right? What does it mean that the male, we already hinted to part of it. We said that the male and the female are God and the Jewish people, or God and you. But still, we need to understand what does it mean that I have a child who's a son, or I have a child who's a daughter. It means, again, that the result of my actions will be either male or female. Okay. בדרך זו, יובן גם העניין, so chapter 4, כפי שהוא עוד לעתיד לבוא, כיוון שלעתיד תהיה התגלות עצמותו יתברך, תוסרנה כל ההגבלות, ויהיה גם ולציין נאמר, איש ואיש הולד בה, איש מזרע תחילה יולד מבחינת זכר. So this also explains why in the future it will always be possible, even if there's no joy of a mitzvah, for the male to beget a male. Why? Because God's very substance will be revealed. What we call this substance will be revealed. And because of that, all the limits, all the laws of nature, as it were, what we're describing here is a spiritual law, but supposedly it started from a physical law that they thought they knew. So all those laws will no longer obligate us, right? So if you want to take it a step further, if I like to, I'll be affected by gravity, and if I don't like to, I won't be affected by gravity. I mean, clearly that's where technology is taking everything, right? It's taking it to the place of complete freedom, where the laws of nature are, in a sense, eradicated. So what do you mean it's eradicated? You have anti-gravity. You find out that, it was always built into nature, that there's a way to cancel it. It was always there. We just had to find a way to do it. But it was always there. God's substance has always been here. There's nothing new. Okay? It's not like that if you find a way to do anti-gravity, you've created something that didn't exist before. No, it was God's substance. It was always here. God's substance is unlimited. There are no limits to it. And so the moment you tap into it, the moment you connect to it, or God decides He wants to reveal it, then you're able to go beyond the limits of reality, even beyond the limits of physical laws. So that's why in the future it will be possible for a male to beget a male. לפי האמור, chapter 5, based on what we just said, תובן המחלוקת בין התלמוד הבבלי ובין התלמוד הירושלמי בקשר לוולד זכר ונקבה. There's a machlokus, there's a dispute between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud regarding the birth of a child. The Babylonian Talmud says, בבבלי נאמר, שעד 40 יום יכולה להועיל בקשת רחמים שיהיה ולד זכר. That until 40 days you can pray for the sex of the child. Meaning there's efficacy in it. It has some potency. If you're going to be praying, you can pray for 40 days, the first 40 days after conception. But after that, after 40 days, tfilat shav. It's an empty prayer. It means nothing. Why? Because the sex has already been determined. That's how they saw it. That you had 40 days. You have to understand this also. You also have to understand this physically. What in the world are they talking about? Where they get this 40 days thing from? But let's leave that.
That's the time it takes to create the uba.
What?
That's the time it takes to create the uba.
Maybe, but the sex is, according to the way we understand it, the sex is determined in the first moment of conception. But it's not so simple, though. Even after the sex has been determined,
you can still go back.
There can be changes. How can there be changes? Oh, so now we get into some territory that is not part of what we want to talk about, but there can be actual changes. But that's the Babylonian Talmud. By Yerushalmi in the Jerusalem Talmud, it says differently. It says שגם לאחר 40 יום, ולפי דעה נוספת גם כשהאישה קוראת ללדת, עשויה ותפילה להועיל, שיהיה ולד זכר. The Jerusalem Talmud, most people don't know this. It says that no, you can pray until the last moment, according to one opinion there. Until the last moment you can decide whether it's going to be a male or female. So obviously today people would say, no. They would say, of course it's possible. Maybe we're not talking about the sex, but the gender.
What is the difference between the sex?
Oh, good question. So now they have this thing that sex is not the same thing as gender. My sex is male or female, that I can't change. But my gender, I identify this way, I identify that way.
And that's against Torah, no, the whole thing.
No, the identity the Torah doesn't talk about at all. Identity, the Torah is not interested in identity. We don't. I can't say it's not interested. The prohibition from having homosexual relations is not about identity. It's about an act. If you want to identify as a woman, identify as a woman. You're still obligated as a man because your sex is male. But you can identify as whatever you want. You want to identify as a rabbit, that's fine too. Whatever you want.
No, a man's not allowed to dress up as a woman.
I didn't say you can dress up that way. I said you identify that way. It's different. It's a very different thing. In any case, how is this possible? הדבר ניתן להסבר לפי האמור כך. אמנם לאחר עיצוב דמות הוולד תפילה כזו היא תפילת שווא, אבל לפי ירושלמי עשויה התפילה להועיל תמיד. משום שבירושלמי, בניגוד לבחינת במחשקים וקושיות שבתלמוד בבלי, שורר מעין הגילוי של העתיד, ובבחינה זו אין קיימות כל הגבלות. So we can explain the discrepancy, the dispute between the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. That the Babylonian Talmud is very much immersed in the present. And in the present, there is no way to get over the limits of nature. In the present situation, like we said regarding the conception and what sex the child will be, the only possibility is if the woman inseminates first, then it will be a male. There can't be that a male will beget a male. The male insemination is not called as a male. Again, whatever that means, we haven't said yet what it means. You can say that means just a physical dimension, but we're not talking about this physical dimension. So by the Babylonian Talmud, this is a limit of nature, and there's no way in the present moment to get over the limit of nature. But the Jerusalem Talmud is living already, the sages in the land of Israel who wrote the Jerusalem Talmud, they were living already in the future. Because that's what it means that the air of the land of Israel wisens a person, makes them wise. What does it mean wise? They see the future. By them, they're describing the future state already. And they're saying, even until the last moment, you can change the sex of the child. Even though it's physically impossible today. You can't do it. But, because we live with a forward-looking approach to everything, this is not called an empty prayer. Because there will come a time when this will be possible physically, all the more so that it's possible by prayer. So we'll leave it here, and then tomorrow we'll start to explain what is this all referring to, because it's referring to something that's very practical. It's not referring just to these questions about the sex of a child. Okay.